Well, good morning, Frank, and welcome to Guancha. And first, I want to congratulate you for the publication of the second volume of your books, Political Order and Political Decay. The first volume, The Origin of Political Order, which talk about the history of political systems from the very beginning, from the Darwinian beginning to the French Revolution, and the second is from that point to globalization. I must confess, the first book was very long, and I suffered through it. And I resolved at that point not to read the second volume, but I couldn't help myself, and I read it anyway. So, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I think it's would be very useful for our readers and our viewers, possibly, for you to first give us a sense of the state of democracy in America, if you will. You spend quite a bit. I mean, it's not going to be the focus of this particular talk, but let's start there, and let's have your analysis of the state of the political system in America and what are the risks and challenges that America faces, which you talk at length in your book.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. I think right now the United States is going through a very challenging period in its history because the political system is very polarized between the two political parties, Republicans and Democrats. This is something that's been building for a long time. There's a lot of partisan rancor, which has resulted in political gridlock. It's very hard for Americans to make decisions on immigration, which has been a big issue recently, or even something as basic as the budget because of these healthcare, because of these disagreements. This is something that the American system has gone through periodically in the past, and one of the big questions I think for the future is, will American democracy be self-correcting? Because I think with the rise of money in politics and special interests, you should have a democratic system where ordinary people will rise up and throw the rascals out.
Right.
It hasn't happened recently, and that's one of the big challenges I think for American politics right now.
Yeah. So I think the interesting point, which I read in your book, and of course in the last couple of decades from political scientists like Menser Olson, which is the point about interest groups, and I think Olson calls them distributive coalitions, and you coined the term beatocracy, which means that interest groups accumulate power over a long period of time, and they become distributive coalitions, and then they capture the political system and hold it hostage. So, in order for something to happen, every subgroup has to be satisfied, and every subgroup acts in its own narrow interest instead of the collective good, and that is what's the ill of the current system at the moment. I mean, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, this is a broader phenomenon that I label political decay, where you have well-organized interest groups that capture, as you say, the political system. I don't think that this is a unique province of democracies. Right. I think this can happen in any political system. So, for example, in the first volume that you found very long and hard to get through, there's a long chapter on ancient China.
Yes.
And at the end of the later Han Dynasty, you had this phenomenon where the regime was captured by elite families. Right. And this is something that went on for the next 300 years, in the period of the Three Kingdoms and so forth. And then it was the more impersonal Chinese system was then restored, in later dynasties. And so it's a cycle that countries go through. I think in the United States, right now, it's become problematic because interest groups are extremely well funded. Our Supreme Court has said that essentially money in politics is a form of free speech that's protected by the First Amendment, which I think is a mistaken interpretation of the Constitution, but that's what the court has said. And so, you have Wall Street, for example, that has a very large concentration of money, and they can block things that are harmful to themselves, and I think that's a really big issue now.
Which view terms vetocracy.
And so we have a system of checks and balances that makes it relatively easy for one part of the political system to block other parts of the political system. And I think that's at the heart of what I call vetocracy, meaning it's ruled by veto.
Yeah, yeah. Another concept that you elaborated on in the book, which I found is the first time I ever really studied this, is the judicialization of political governance. So every judge is making policies. Would you sort of give a sense of that? Because I think that would be new to our readers and our viewers.
Well, there are many administrative functions that and by the way, this is a uniquely American problem. Right. It's not a problem that exists in many European democracies. But in the United States, we have this very strong tradition of common law that comes from England. So law was really the first institution that was established way before the colonies were independent of Britain and there was democracy or anything else. And it means that judges in this system have actually a lot of policy-making power. So, for example, the legalization of abortion, which in other democracies was done by the legislature, in the United States was really done by a decision of the courts. Yeah. And in the ordinary enforcement of law, ordinary Americans actually have the right to sue the government to either enforce a law or to prevent the government from enforcing a law in a way that just doesn't exist in other countries. And so this is one of the respects in which I think the courts have taken over functions that are more properly played by the executive branch or by an administrative agency.
Right. Yeah, for instance, in California, we had this conversation that the high-speed rail project, Governor Brown's high-speed rail project has more than 200 lawsuits on it. I mean, that would be a part of that.
That's right, and that's what makes a lot of infrastructure projects. It delays them and makes them more expensive because of the ability of private individuals to sue.
Yeah. Now, according to Mentor Olson, when the political system is captured by distributive coalitions, there was always almost no solution to it. You're basically stuck short of a revolution or some kind of external shock. So how does the system get out of that? I mean the revolutions and external shocks are not welcome phenomena anywhere. Yeah. So how do we, if a system is indeed captured by distributive coalitions and is ossified that way, how do you break out of that? I mean, what kind of reforms, for instance, does America need, political reforms does America need to get beyond this, if ever?
Well, I think that sometimes the shock takes the form of an economic crisis. Right. And this is what happened in the 1930s. You had the stock market crash in 1929 and then a big banking crisis. Right. It led to greater than 20% unemployment rate, and a lot of economic pain. And I think that was a shock that was sufficient to then create the New Deal coalition led by Franklin Roosevelt that basically put in place the American welfare state. Yeah. In the period after the 1930s. That's the way a democracy, I think, is supposed to work, where ordinary people are harmed by special interests and they mobilize and, under the proper leadership, they change policy. In 2007, 2008, we had a very big financial crisis, but the policymakers, I think, intervened fairly quickly and they put a floor under the crisis, and the unemployment rate really never rose above about 10%, and now it's down to somewhere about 5%. And I think that the problem was that although it's good that we didn't have a depression, it wasn't enough of a shock to really force the big actors to rethink a lot of their policies. Yeah. And it's not clear to me what's going to cause that, because I do think that the kind of gridlock we have is going to be in place for some time. Right.
The current midterm election may worsen it for a short period for the next phase, it seems. Good. So let's move on to the Chinese case. First, I have a question for you. Just I've been reading your studies, your books for many years. You are a towering figure in political science. Your major name, Yang. And since then, I'm a student of politics, and I've been reading. So, since when did you take an active interest in China? Obviously, you devoted 2 chapters in this new volume, and in the first volume, there's a lot of Chinese analysis and Chinese content, and you've written about it. You're doing projects in China. So, since when did you take an active interest in China, and why?
Well, I think I really started with the first volume of this book because it struck me that if you're going back over the whole history of world politics and where basic institutions came from, China is obviously an important part of that story. And what I argued in the first volume was that if you think about the modern state, meaning a bureaucratic, centralized, meritocratic, and impersonal state.
The Weberian state.
A Weberian, what Max Weber described as a modern state. It seemed to me that China, among all world civilizations, was the one society that invented it first, and it really happened about 1,800 years before a similar kind of institution appeared in Europe. But for various reasons, I think Western historians have not credited China with this. And I think part of the reason for that is that in the West, a lot of the impressions that people had of traditional China came from the late years of the Qing dynasty, which was to begin
with.
Not
the prettiest moment.
Yeah, it was a foreign dynasty, and it was also already in the period of decline in the 19th century. And they don't appreciate the character of Chinese government, from a very early point, beginning with the Qin unification in the 3rd century BC. And it seemed to me that story was an important one to tell, and it's one that I think a lot of Chinese themselves have lost. They've lost their connection with that history because of politics,
the revolutions,
basically.
Yeah. So which brings up the next point I want to discuss. You've said in the book that the current Chinese governance system is very much a continuation of dynastic China. I mean, of course, it's a modernized version, but nevertheless, a continuation in many essential aspects of China's long dynastic history. And I think it's an interesting point. I mean, it's not being talked about very much, even inside China. And regardless of you've said, regardless of the intention of those since Deng Xiaoping, they are actually recovering China's traditional state. In fact, many I might argue that since the collapse of Chinese state at the beginning of at the late 19th century, the Chinese have been trying again and again to recover that state. So tell us about that. How you see it?
Well, the traditional Chinese state was built around bureaucracy.
Right.
It was built around an educational system that trained people to take a civil service examination in order to enter the bureaucracy. That was the main avenue of social mobility for poor people.
Right.
If you had a bright son, you could, enter the Mandarin.
It's meritocratic.
It was meritocratic in that sense. It was centralized, and it was impersonal in the sense that there's an aspiration that the Chinese government treat citizens as citizens and not on the basis of kinship ties or, local elite, connections. Right. So, for example, the central government would send representatives out to the provinces and make sure that that person had no marriage or kinship, connections with the locals because they wanted to administer things impersonally. And I think that's the great tradition in China, and that's the thing that the Chinese, in a sense, invented, which then other civilizations, including Western civilization, came to have. What China never developed, I think, on the other side were institutions of constraint like the rule of law, or certainly anything like, electoral accountability that in the West counterbalance that state.
Yeah, which we will talk about. But I think it's, what you're saying actually coincides with a very interesting development in recent years, which is the CCP, the party, and its leadership, and the intellectual elites in China have been conspicuously reviving the Confucian ethos in Chinese society. It's almost unprecedented in recent memory. I mean, you got Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, in numerous occasions giving speeches about China's traditional values and its tradition, and saying that the current party and the current Chinese governance is the inheritor of that heritage, which is very interesting. Do you see that as connected to what your own analysis?
Well, I think,
or are they becoming consciously more consciously aware of what you pointed out earlier?
I think that that heritage was always there it wasn't something that people were consciously imitating, but I think the tradition of stateness was there, not just in China, but in all of the surrounding Asian countries that were influenced by Chinese Confucianism. So that would include Korea, Japan, Vietnam. All of these countries have had this pre-modern understanding of what it meant to have a centralized state, and they also, I think very importantly, had a very strong sense of national identity that was built around common language. In China, a common literary language that gave this centralized state a great deal more coherence compared to, really any other part of the world.
Yeah. So the idea of the state, I think, is also interesting. In the last, I think, 10, 15 years, you have done a large body of work on that subject, on the state, beginning with the book, I think it was called State Building. Really well-written book. And it's an interesting development. For some time, maybe 25, 30 years ago, at some point, people had thought the idea of a state was passé, or the notion of state competency was passé. But you have, among political scientists, you have sort of led the way in reviving the concept that the state was important. I think in this volume, you've also further pointed out that a competent state, a functioning state, was a prerequisite of political and national success. Without which, we've seen a lot of situations where, especially Americans go in and they institute different political systems, essentially electoral democracy, but they don't have a state yet. So a competent state being at the center, or being at least a prerequisite of any kind of national political success. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, I think it's hard to generalize across the West, because in Europe they've got a much stronger tradition of state, in France and Germany and places like that. But Americans are different, because democracy was always critical to American identity, and Americans, I think, in many respects took the state for granted. And particularly after the rise of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, we went through a period where there was a dominant ideology that said
anti-stateness.
The state was the enemy of free markets and individual freedom and so forth. And so the pendulum swung away from thinking about the state to thinking that everything could be done simply as a matter of private enterprise and so forth. And I think this led to some policy mistakes, both in the United States and in the kind of advice that we gave to other countries.
In many developing countries.
But I think now the pendulum has begun to swing back, because I think people have realized that that was a wrong balance.
Yeah. And in many ways, I think the Chinese struggle has been that, and it plays a defining role in the characteristics of Chinese state now, which is that after the Qing dynasty collapse, the so-called 100 years of century of humiliation, is the source of that tremendous suffering. The Chinese people suffered enormously for a long period of time, was perceived, I think correctly, as the lack of any resemblance of a functioning state that could protect people, that could educate people, or provide health, any of that stuff, where it defend its borders.
That's right.
You know, so I think that speaks to the Chinese psyche, and it accounts for a lot of issues that we also that we have today. You know, so I think let's move on to we've been talking about essentially chapter 25 of your volume, and let's stay there for a little longer. You know, I think in that chapter you talk about models of political governance, and I don't want to, you know, the term democracy is perhaps one of the most misused and even abused terms in politics. I mean, everybody claims he's running a democracy, so the word's almost lost its meaning. But what I found very interesting is that you made one particular classification of political systems. One you call upward accountability, the other is downward accountability. I mean, realizing it's probably a continuum, right? It's not binary. You know, yes. in an upwardly accountable system, you have downward accountability elements and features, and vice versa. But obviously, having said that, it seems to me that the electoral systems in America is a downward accountability, and the system in China is probably more of essentially an upward accountability.
That's right.
And throughout his history is that way. And now it occurs to me by reading your book, there are advantages in each, and there are inherent risks and in the DNA of each. And we talked about the risks in downward accountability, which is the autocracy in Mensa Olson being captured by distributive coalitions and ossification that way, and political decay. And of course, in upward accountability, you have the issues of corruption, patronage, and a slew of other things. So maybe let's talk about that.
Well, so first of all, you have to say why accountability is important.
Right.
And I think the reason is that governments, if they're going to be just, have to serve not just the self-interest of the people running the government, they have to respond to the interests of the broad society. In the West, we feel that this can only come about through procedures like free and fair elections, but I think in China there's a belief that you can serve the interests of the people even in the absence of these procedures, that the government can still be responsive to public pressures and so forth. So there's an acceptance, I think, of the view that at least substantively governments need to be accountable. And the question is really, how do you achieve that accountability? And I think in the Chinese system, you have a party that defines policies by its view of what it thinks the society, the broad society, needs. And therefore, if you're a public official, a local official, your main responsibility is upwards, because you don't face local elections where the citizens can directly influence what you say. I think the problem in China is twofold. So one is just a problem of information. So one good thing about actually having local elections is that if people are unhappy, they've got an automatic way of registering that unhappiness, which is simply to vote you out of office the next time. In an upwardly accountable system, it depends on the people at the top of the system knowing what the citizens' preferences are. And without elections, they're dependent on developing other sources of information. And I think both in dynastic China and in modern China, that's a problem, is just knowing what the people want and think and are reacting, because in a modern society, that's very dynamic and it changes very, very rapidly.
I guess the point and the objective, regardless of whatever the system, the objective should be responsive governance. Somehow, whether it's upwardly accountable or downward accountable, you want to be able to be responsive in some fashion. Now, in fact, actually, in China, they've experimented. It's no longer an experiment. Village elections have been the norm for a generation now, 20, 30 years. And most of the village heads are elected by voting.
Yeah.
But looking back, I think the consensus is that it's been a failure. It's mired with corruption, ineffectiveness. So you've cited Lily Tai, a young political scientist from Michigan or something?
MIT.
MIT, yeah. And she studied village elections or village governance, and she has cited informal mechanisms for the party to collect data and what the people are looking for. And it seems that that's also an effective way by custom instead of a formal sort of elections. And elections has not really worked at the village level. I mean, people are trying to figure out why. I don't think there's a conclusion yet. But she has studied a large variety of informal ways of collecting data and responding to it, and have said that has been effective.
It depends, I guess, on your measure of effectiveness.
Right, of course,
because I think one thing that sets China apart from other governments that don't have formal procedures like elections is that they do pay attention to public opinion.
Right.
And they respond to social protest, not just with repression, but with some degree of accommodation. I guess the question down the road is, without more formal kinds of procedures, can you actually get sufficient information? So this is why I think this is another area of continuity between dynastic China and modern China, because in dynastic China you had exactly this problem. The Chinese empire at the end of the Han dynasty was roughly about the size of the Roman Empire, maybe 60 million people. It was really a gigantic political unit
at the time,
for that time. And especially with that kind of poor information technology, the leaders in Luoyang or Chang'an, wherever the capital was, simply could not keep track of what was going on in the kingdom. And they had to delegate power to local prefectures or commanderies, but then the local people sometimes didn't tell them what was going on. And so they had to pile
layers and layers, different kind of agencies to make sure that they get the right data. That's very interesting. I mean, that happens in many ways. So of course, I mean, I think it's clear that the inherent risks in upward accountability system is, well, first of all, you need a good emperor, of course. So whether it's the emperor or the collective ruling body, the governing body, in our case, the party itself being healthy, with good intentions. I mean, that's a prerequisite, of course. And then with that prerequisite, the risks you face, the challenges you face, is how do you collect data from the bottom to ensure that upward. It's the same risk a CEO faces in a company.
That's right.
In a large company.
That's right.
How do I make sure my department heads are telling me what the customers are telling him, because he's got an interest in telling me good news, right? So how do I? So that's really it's interesting.
And I think the one. So I think that's right. And the one difference with a private company is that it can go bankrupt.
Right. So a country cannot afford to go bankrupt. The feedback mechanism. Now, so in a downwardly accountable system, what are the inherent risks and challenges that you need to be aware of and manage?
Well, so I think they solve the information problem in a very direct way. I think actually with appropriately decentralized government, the government can actually, because it's so much closer to the people, can actually respond much more quickly. So in America, for example, every single school district is really run by a local school board that's locally elected, and so it's the parents of the children that make the decisions on who the principal should be and this sort of thing. One problem with that kind of system is it can be actually local corruption, because local governments can be captured by elites in different localities. And then I think procedurally, sometimes the even the fact that you have elections doesn't mean that you still aren't affected by things like money and so forth. But I have to say, as an American, I still think that that's a better system because those procedures are really important in making sure that the higher up officials don't hide misbehavior, and it depends on, I think, the free flow of information as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, aside from those risks, aside from these shortcomings or interest groups and what have you, I guess one other item is making decisions on a longer term or shorter term basis. And you've talked about in chapter 25 about political autonomy. So a ruling body that's somewhat or relatively autonomous of the different groups within a society to capture or influence or hijack it. And if that, assuming that body is good, is healthy, it's able to make decisions based on long-term objectives, and it's able to engineer and implement those decisions without being bogged down by these interest groups. And I think that the Chinese success, to whatever extent you can characterize that as a success in the last few decades, was probably largely due to that.
Well, Aristotle made a distinction between benevolent monarchy and tyranny. And he argues that a benevolent monarchy can make good decisions and act in the public interest quite effectively. I think that the problem is, as you said, this assumption that you had to have a good emperor to begin with. And so I think, beginning with Deng Xiaoping, you've had pretty good leadership in China. The Chinese system was able to change its economic basis much more rapidly than a democracy would have been able to after 1978. But the big problem is, how do you guarantee that you'll always have a good emperor?
There's no guarantee.
And, in a sense, the American or the Western system of procedural checks and balances means that, on the upside, it may prevent the good emperor from really doing things quickly and decisively. But on the downside, it gives you some protection against bad emperors, and I think that's, in the long run, very important.
Now, talking about good emperor and bad emperor, of course, it's much more complex than having just a good guy or a bad guy. I mean, I think in your book you pointed out, I think correctly, that even in the long centuries of imperial China, with very few exceptions, the power of the emperor was greatly constrained. So I want to talk about constraints on the power of the state now. So in fact, absolute unchallenged personal power in a history of in imperial China was rare, and they were constrained by bureaucracy, they were constrained by moral codes, by rituals, all sorts of rules. And of course, today, China is led and governed by the CCP, the party. And of course, the party has 80 million members, and it's a complex body. It has its own myriad rules and the ways. In many ways, it's kind of opaque, so it's hard to study. So I think it's a very interesting point. So if you want to make predictions about how long Chinese political system could keep producing good emperors, which really means how long can the party stay relatively healthy. I'm sure it's got a problem. Corruption is a big problem they're trying to fix. But on a net basis, how long can the party stay healthy to sustain the period of prosperity that we've been experiencing to date? And I guess that would take a lot of study of the party itself and the structures within the party.
Because it depends a lot on individuals. And I mean, I think, so if there's a broad way of characterizing Chinese government and how it's different from Western government, in China there's been a much greater emphasis on morality and informal constraints rather than strong formal procedural constraints through law and through things like elections.
Yeah.
And that has advantages and disadvantages. But the traditional system, I think, was ideologically more coherent than the current one, because you had a body of Confucian classics that was the basis for bureaucratic education and so forth. Today, I think there's some degree of confusion because on the one hand, the party is still Marxist-Leninist, but on the other hand, there's this desire to revive traditional Confucian values, and the two are not necessarily compatible with one another.
Yeah. And well, that comes back to our earlier discussion about the party's intention and its work in reviving traditional values. And in many ways, if you really study the party, it functions very, very much like in accordance to Chinese traditional values, in the way they promote people, in the way they see their role. Obviously, there's not it's not the Soviet ideology anymore. I guess it's not about the renaissance of the Chinese nation, which is a rallying cry for the country. And that adds, at least in the foreseeable future, won't last forever, but at least in the foreseeable future, that adds a weighty moral component to its own self-image and its legitimacy in Chinese society.
It does, but I would say the Marxist-Leninist component also emphasizes equality in a way that was never emphasized in traditional China. And there's been a big rise in inequality because of the economic policies that the party has pursued in recent years, and that I think is, a big problem for China because those two,
the contradiction.
It's a contradiction.
That's right. The egalitarian desire, but the egalitarianism was a big part of Confucian ethos as well.
I wouldn't say it was egalitarianism in economic terms. I mean, what it was impersonality of the state
and upward mobility.
The state, the state permitted, some avenues for upward mobility, and it tried to treat citizens on a fairly equal basis. But it permitted very large discrepancies in wealth and social status, and I think that that's something that communist China has been very, opposed to.
Yeah, that's right. So now let's move on to the concept of rule of law or the law. I mean, the second most abused term is probably rule of law. Everybody claims they want rule of law, but they probably mean different things. So we want to be careful with that term. Now, in the book, you talk about the unique religious roots in European history in the development of the law and the role of the law, which is very different from other parts of the country and other civilizations, especially China, of course. Could you talk about that?
Well, actually, I think it's China that's the outlier. I think in Hindu India, in the Muslim world, in the Christian West,
religion began.
In ancient Israel, in all of these different cultures, you had a tradition of law coming from outside the government. The law was the domain of a religious hierarchy, and the rulers had to go to the religious authorities to get legitimacy and religious sanction. And I would say that China is the only world civilization that never had this kind of a religious hierarchy that stood outside of the power of the emperor. And in that respect, I think China never really had a tradition of rule of law. It had rule by law, where law was seen as the commands of the emperor that was binding uniformly on citizens, but the emperor himself was not subject to law. And that, I think, is the essence of the definition, my definition of the rule of law, that if the emperor is not subject to the law, then it's really not rule of law.
So, but talk a little bit more about the religious aspects and the cultural roots of what you define as rule of law, because I think that would be new to the
So
readers.
In the West, the deepest political tradition is actually a tradition of law. It's not a tradition of a centralized state, and certainly not of democracy, because that doesn't appear until 2 centuries ago.
Right.
But the law in the West really arises out of the Catholic Church.
Right.
Catholic Church fights a big conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor in the 11th century to bring forth a revived Roman law that becomes the basis of the civil law traditions in Western Europe today, which involves the ability of the Catholic Church to choose its own bishops and priests and to preside over this ecclesiastical law free from the interference of state power. And that means that all of European political development happens against a background where judges and lawyers have their own institutions that are not strictly under the control of the state.
Yeah.
And I think that limits the power of the state
Right.
in the beginning.
But in fact, actually, I think you did point out in the book actually prevented the building of state in Europe for a long period of time.
Well, it limited the kind of absolutism.
Yeah.
And the only, I don't know if you call it a fully European country, but the only place where this wasn't true was in Russia.
Yeah.
where
Eastern Church.
The Eastern Church remained completely under the control of political authority, and therefore it never served as an obstacle to the ambitions of the czars.
Right. Well, I guess another unique aspect in the development of Western Europe was the collapse of the Western Empire, which left this enormous power vacuum where the church, the Catholic Church, stepped in and was able to build these power bases independent of the princes, because the princes were weak. There's no imperial power. And in Orthodox sphere, where that did not happen. The state was strong, and religious authorities were subservient to political authority. But in the West, because of the total collapse and the barbarians and what have you, the church's power was built. But the downside of that, of course, was the church's power was very invasive. It was very in Italy. It prevented the state in Italy from emerging for centuries until late 19th century.
Well, no, yeah, in a sense you could say that, but it also meant that it preserved a realm of freedom in Europe,
right?
Where ambitious monarchs couldn't do whatever they wanted. They couldn't just confiscate the property of their their citizens.
Right. In the case of Henry VIII, couldn't even divorce. Yeah. Well, that's good. So now. How does, I guess of course, China's tradition is very different. It didn't have, China had a debate about, the legalist approach and the Confucian approach, and it was settled in the Han Dynasty and went back and forth. Of course, it had a lot of elements of the legalist ideas in its governance, but the Confucian line was the main line, and of course, China never really had a god. The Confucian religion did not have supernatural aspirations, if you will. So China does not have the experience in this religious development and cultural development. And of course, China is trying to build a governance system where the decision making is more rule-based, and to improve legal governance. I want to avoid the term rule of law. To improve legal governance. So how does it's interesting? And the Chinese tradition, as you pointed out in the book, is contextual and situational, and it's a moral
more so than in the West.
Right. It's a continuum, of course. And the European tradition is more abstract, a priori. You decide in advance. And it's generalized, and the Chinese moral tradition is contextual and situational, circumstantial. So how do we, in a country where its tradition is such, how do you? I think over its long history, China did have long periods where the rules were clear and well enforced, and people felt that the society was just, and I think that's what they're trying to build. So I guess my question is, with different cultural and religious traditions, how do you build a society and a political system that have enough procedural checks, procedural justice, but not so much that it leads to judicialization of political governance?
Well, I think in China's case, the root to that is not religion, it's just rational self-interest.
Right.
I think that what happened after 1978 is that the leadership in the party, having gone through the Cultural Revolution, felt that their personal survival was threatened by the absence of rules.
Yeah, it would depend on more rules. Yeah, that's right.
And the reason that you had the emergence of collective leadership, you had a regularized system of term limits where the party leadership turns over every 10 years. You had retirement, requirements.
Yeah, that's right.
A lot of these rules were created because people thought that without rules you had just arbitrary, the possibility of just arbitrary dictatorship, and that was not a safe situation. And I think in general, people like to have clear rules. People like to know what to expect.
Right.
Can they keep their property? Are they going to be treated impersonally, or is someone going to favor somebody because they're a friend of the the person in power?
Yeah.
So I think that there's a kind of universal need for a more rule-based kind of decision making.
But I guess you don't want a society where the rules are so rigid and so ossified that you can't move, you can't reform.
That's right.
I mean, I guess that reform and the law are probably in contradiction to each other in some respect.
You need flexibility.
Right. I mean, in the U.S. you have eminent domain. Right. That means that the collective does have the right to take away a personal property to build a road somehow if it determines for the collective good. So I guess it's a continuum. It's not binary. One aspect that troubles me in the book is that you talk about the law being independent of sovereignty, of political sovereignty, and as a part of the Western tradition, and law's role in the West political development. But it can't really be completely independent of political sovereignty, right? For instance, the U.S. Constitution, it can be amended. There's a political process to amend the Constitution, so there is a sovereignty, a political sovereignty that's above the Constitution, right?
I think really in the American system, the people are sovereign.
Right.
They approve a constitution that becomes a fundamental law, and I think the real difference that we're talking about is that the constitutional level of law has to be approved by a supermajority of Americans.
Right. It's very difficult to amend it.
And also to ratify it in the first place. It's not simply a majority vote.
Right.
Whereas ordinary law usually can be passed simply by majorities,
Right.
and the sovereignty still rests on the people as expressed in their, voting for a constitution, in the first place.
Right. But the political authority is within the sovereignty of the people and whatever it is.
That's right.
But the political sovereignty is above the law. Then I mean, there is. Theoretically,
they create.
Theoretically, you could get rid of the Bill of Rights.
Yeah,
in the Constitution, right? It's possible.
No, I think in democratic theory, well, it's a complicated issue though, because there's also a strand of thought that would maintain that there are certain, in a sense, absolute
natural law,
rules that also have to apply. This is what Abraham Lincoln argued, that democracy and democratic sovereignty was not the only principle in American government, but the principle of equality in the Declaration of Independence was also an independent principle, and that the people could not therefore vote to make certain other people slaves.
Right.
And this was really the issue that was argued between Lincoln and
but we
others.
we don't know that. I mean, theoretically, you could amend the Constitution. There is a process provided.
Except that, but Lincoln argued that the Declaration of Independence was also one of the founding documents of the country,
right.
And was in a certain sense a higher principle than the Constitution itself.
Yeah, but Lincoln actually suspended habeas corpus.
Well, Well, no, that's right. I mean, I think that...
So he exercised political authority above the law.
Yes, but again, in alignment with, this important founding document.
Another document, right? Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's very interesting. I mean, it seems to me there's inherent contradiction. Of course, everything has inherent contradictions. Good. So I want to, there are probably, in the book, this will scare people, but you've alluded that essentially China is trying to develop a more legal environment, a more legal culture, improve legal governance. You've also alluded in the book that essentially lawyers are revolutionaries. The lawyers played a very decisive role in the French Revolution, and within that tradition, which is we talk about the law being independent public authority. But I guess there's another part of the Western tradition, the English tradition. Edmund Burke, for instance, the Reflections on the Revolution in France, he spoke against that kind of doctrine about deciding things a priori and generalizing a set of principles and rules that you have to follow. He spoke for a more organic development where laws are in accordance to culture and customs. In fact, I guess that the entire British Parliament rules only on custom. By custom, there's no law that gives them the power. I mean, the English Parliament rules by custom.
That's not really true. I mean, they pass statutes, and it has the effect of law. But
right. But their ruling position was by custom.
But people like Friedrich Hayek argue that the common law is basically judge-made law. It's very decentralized, and judges react to local conditions, so it's not static. It evolves, but it's also not something that is necessarily planned by a sovereign single.
Right. Yeah, very good. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, and I hope it will enlighten a lot of people, a lot of our readers and viewers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.